Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle, Book 5. Justice in its most general sense is voluntary obedience to law. As such, it includes all the moral virtues. In its limited or particular sense, it signifies taking no more than one's fair share of fortune's goods, which implies equality or due proportion in their distribution and in correction of injustices. Money is a measure of value that makes possible a fair exchange of goods and services in society. Can a man be unjust to himself? Chapter 1. We come now to investigate justice and injustice. We have to consider the kinds of acts with which they deal, the sense in which justice is a mean, and the extremes between which it is a mean. In the investigation, we will follow the same plan we have used with the virtues already described. Let us first then ascertain all the various meanings of the word unjust. A man is unjust if he breaks the law of the land. He is unjust if he takes more than his fair share of anything. Clearly then, the just man will be 1. One who keeps the law, 2. One who is fair. So what is just is 1. What is lawful, and 2. What is fair. What is unjust is 1. What is unlawful, 2. What is unfair. Now, as the unjust man in the second of these two senses is one who takes more than his share, he will be concerned with goods, not with all goods, but with all the goods of fortune, which in an absolute sense are always good, though not always good for the individual. They are indeed the objects of men's prayers and efforts, but men ought rather to pray that the things that are absolutely good may be good also for them, and to choose the things that are good for them. The unjust man does not always choose more than his share. On the contrary, he chooses less than his share of something absolutely evil. But the lesser of two evils may, it seems, in a sense, be called a good. And to take more than one's share means to take more than one's share of something good. Of this he is regarded as taking more than his share. Such a person is unfair, for unfairness is a general and comprehensive term. Chapter 3. The lawbreaker being, as we saw, unjust, and the law-abiding person just, evidently any lawful act is in some sense just, for all the acts prescribed by legislative authority are lawful, and we call them all just. Laws dictate on all subjects that which is to the interest of the community as a whole, or of those who are its best or leading citizens, either in virtue or in any other way. Thus, in one sense, we apply the term just to everything that tends to create and conserve happiness and the elements of happiness in the body politic. The law commands us to act as a brave man, that is, not to leave the ranks, or run away, or throw down our arms. To act as a temperate man, that is, to abstain from adultery and outrage, and to act as a good-tempered man, that is, to abstain from violence and abuse. And so with all the other virtues and vices, it prescribes some acts and prohibits others, and does all this in a right spirit, if it is a right law, or in a spirit not equally right, if it is a law passed in the heat of the moment. Justice, then, in this form is complete virtue, though not in an absolute sense, still so in relation to one's neighbors. Hence, it is often regarded as the supreme virtue, more glorious than the star of eve or dawn. Or as the proverb runs, quote, "Justice is the summary of all virtue," end quote. It is in the fullest sense complete virtue, for it is the exercise of complete virtue. It is complete because he who possesses it can practice virtue not merely in himself, but towards his neighbors, and many people can be good at home, but not in their relations with their neighbors. So there is a truth in the saying of Bias that office reveals the man, for a man in office is at once brought into relation and association with other men. For this same reason, justice alone of the virtues seems to mean the good of the other fellow, since it implies a relation to other people and works for the interest of someone else, whether our ruler or a simple fellow citizen. As then the worst of men is one who shows his depravity both in his own life and in his relation to his friends. So the best of men is one who shows his goodness not in his own life only, but in his relation to others, for this is a difficult task. Justice, therefore, in this sense of the word, is not a part of virtue, but the whole of virtue. Its opposite, injustice, is not a part of vice, but the whole of vice. If it be asked, what is the difference between virtue and justice in this sense, the answer is clear from what we have already said. They are the same, but the idea of them is different. The state of character which, if regarded in its relation to others, is justice, if regarded absolutely as a moral state, is virtue. Chapter 4. But we are now to investigate the justice which is only a part of virtue, for there is such a justice, we believe. Similarly, there is a particular injustice which we must inquire into. That it does exist we may infer from the following fact. A person may display other forms of wickedness in his conduct, and yet, though he acts wrongly, not take more than properly belongs to him. He may, for example, throw away his shield out of cowardice, or use abusive language out of bad temper, or refuse money to a friend out of stinginess. And one who takes more than his share may do no other act of vice. Certainly not all of them, yet plainly he is wicked in some way, for we condemn his act. In other words, he is unjust. There is then an injustice which is a part of injustice in the broader sense, and a use of the word unjust in which it is a part of the wider field of injustice as law-breaking. Again, if one man commits adultery for the sake of getting something and makes money by it, while another suffers expense and loss for the sake of his passion, the latter would seem licentious but not grasping, and the former unjust but not licentious. The reason being clearly that his object was not the satisfaction of his passion, but gain. Again, all other kinds of unjust act or crime may be ascribed to some particular vice. Adultery to incontinence, desertion in battle to cowardice, and violence to anger. But an act committed for the sake of gain is ascribed to no other vice but injustice. Evidently, then, besides injustice, in the broader sense, there is another particular injustice, which has the same name because its definition falls under the same head. For both have to do with our relations to other people, but the latter is bent on getting honor or property or safety or whatever comprehensive name we may have for all these, and inspired by the pleasure or gain, whereas the former is concerned with the whole wide sphere of virtuous action. Chapter 5. We see then that there are different kinds of justice, and a kind that is different from complete virtue. We must therefore look into its nature and character. The unjust has been defined in two distinct senses, namely as what is unlawful and as what is unfair. Similarly, the just is defined as what is lawful and as what is fair. The injustice we first described corresponds to unlawfulness. But since what is unfair and what is unlawful are not the same thing, but stand to each other in the relation of part to whole, parenthesis, what is unfair being always unlawful, but what is unlawful not always being unfair, end parenthesis, it follows that the words unjust and injustice, when used in the sense of unfairness, have a different meaning from the same words when used in the larger sense, standing to them in the relation of parts to wholes. For injustice in this limited sense is a part of injustice in the broader sense, and similarly justice in the sense of fairness is a part of justice in the broader sense. We must therefore speak now of particular justice and particular injustice, and similarly of the just and the unjust. We may set aside then the justice and injustice which correspond to complete virtue and vice, the former being the exercise of complete virtue, and the latter of complete vice in our relations to others. We know, too, how just and unjust acts corresponding to universal justice and injustice are to be recognized. The majority of the acts the law prescribes are actions that belong to complete virtue, for the law bids us practice every virtue and forbids us to practice any vice. And the things that help to produce complete virtue are all prescribed in the laws that have been passed, providing for an education of the individual, which makes him not a good citizen, but a good man in the absolute sense. We must decide later whether this is a function of political art or of some other, for it may not in all cases be the same thing to be a good man and a good citizen. Chapter 6. As the person who is unjust and the thing which is unjust are unfair or unequal, there is evidently a mean between the inequalities. This mean is what is fair or equal. For any kind of action that takes too much or too little may also take what is fair or equal. If then the unjust is the unequal, the just is the equal, as indeed everyone sees without argument. And since the equal is a mean between two extremes, the just will be a mean. But equality implies at least two persons or things. The just then is a mean and equal and relative to certain persons. Inasmuch as it is a mean between the extremes of too much and too little. Inasmuch as it is equal, it involves at least two things, and inasmuch as it is just, it is so for certain purposes. Justice then must imply four terms at least, because the person for whom it is just are two, and the things with which it is concerned are two likewise. If the persons are equal, the things awarded them too should be equal. For one thing should be to the other thing as one person is to the other person. If the persons are not equal, they should not have equal shares. The cause of strife and complaints is either that people who are equal are given unequal shares, or that people who are not equal are given equal shares. The same principle may be seen applied in the idea of merit. For everybody agrees that justice in distribution should be based on merit of some sort, only people do not all understand the same thing by merit. Democrats take it to mean freedom, supporters of oligarchy, wealth, or noble blood, and aristocrats, excellence. Justice, then, is a sort of proportion, for proportion is not a property of abstract number only, but of number everywhere. Proportion is equality of ratios, implying four terms at least. Chapter 7. The just, then, in this sense, is the proportionate, and the unjust, the disproportionate. The disproportionate may take the form either of excess or defect, which is what actually happens when the doer of an injustice has too much of something good and the victim too little. In the case of two evils, the contrary is the case, for the lesser evil compared with the greater counts as a good, because the lesser evil is more to be desired than the greater, and what is desirable is a good, and what is more desirable is a greater good. This, then, is one form of justice, that is, of particular justice. The last form of justice is the corrective, which is shown in connection with private actions, both voluntary and involuntary. This justice is different in kind from the former. Distributive justice, which deals with common property, always follows the rule of proportion we have described. When, for instance, distribution is made to two or more people out of a common fund, it will be in accordance with the ratio of the contributions which they have severally made to that fund. The injustice, too, that is opposed to this form of justice is a violation of proportion. But the justice that deals with private acts, although in a sense it means fairness or equality, and the corresponding injustice means unfairness or inequality, follows not that kind of proportion, but the proportion of arithmetic. For it makes no difference here whether it is a good man who has defrauded a bad man, or a bad man who has defrauded a good man, or whether it is a good or a bad man who has committed adultery. The law looks only to the degree of the injury. It treats the parties as equal, and asks only if one is the author and the other the victim of injustice, or if one inflicted and the other sustained an injury. Injustice in this sense too means unfairness or inequality, and the endeavor of the judge is to equalize it. For when one person deals a blow and the other receives it, or one person kills and the other is killed, The suffering and the action are divided into unequal parts, and it is the effort of the judge to restore equality by the penalty he inflicts, since the penalty is so much subtracted from the aggressor's profit. For the term profit is applied generally in such cases, though it is not always strictly appropriate. For example, the profit is his who strikes the blow, and the loss is his who suffers it. At any rate, when the suffering is assessed in the court of law, the one is termed profit and the other loss. The fair or the equal, then, is the mean between excess and defect, and the profit and the loss are excess and defect, though in opposite senses. More of the good and less of the evil are profit, and more of the evil and less of the good are loss. The mean between them is, as we said, the equal, which we call justice. Hence, corrective justice is a mean between profit and loss. This is the reason why, when people dispute, they have recourse to a judge, and to go to the judge is to go to justice, for the judge is set up to be a sort of personification of justice, and people look for the mean in a judge, and sometimes call judges mediators, which implies that if they get the mean, they will get what is just. The just then is a mean, as the judge is a mean. So the just in corrective justice is a mean between profit and loss of a particular kind in cases of voluntary action. It sees to it that the parties to an action have the same amount after it as before. Chapter 8. People seek to return either evil for evil or good for good. It seems like slavery to them not to return an evil, and if they do not return a good, there is no interchange of services. And it is this interchange that holds society together. Therefore men build a temple of the graces in their streets to encourage reciprocity of services, for that is a characteristic of grace, to return the service of one who has been gracious to us, and take the initiative in being gracious ourselves. Now, proportionate returns are brought about by cross-exchange. Thus, let A represent a builder, B a shoemaker, C a house, and D a shoe. The builder then must get from the cobbler a part of his work and give him his own work in return. If there is, first, proportionate equality in the goods, and then reciprocity follows, the results of which we are speaking is attained. Otherwise, the bargain will not be equal or permanent. For the work of one man may perhaps be superior to that of the other, and then they must be equalized. This is equally true in all the arts. They would be ruined if the result for the receiver were not, in kind, quantity, and quality, the same as the result for the doer. For it is not two doctors who combine to exchange, but a doctor and a farmer, and in general, people who are different and not equal and who need to be equalized. Then the things they have to exchange must somehow be made comparable. This is why money was invented. Money is a sort of medium, or mean, for it measures everything and consequently measures excess and defect. For instance, the number of shoes equivalent to a house or a mill. As a builder then is to a shoemaker, so must so many shoes be to a house. Otherwise there would be no exchange and no intermingling. And the calculation will be impossible unless the goods are somehow equalized. Hence the necessity of a single universal standard of measurement, as we said before. Actually, this standard is the demand for mutual services, which holds society together. For if people wanted nothing of each other, or wanted it irregularly, there would be either no exchange, or it would not be the same as it is now. But money is a sort of recognized representative of demand. That is the reason why it is called money, nomisma, because it is not nature, but a law, nomos, that gives it existence, and it is in our power to change it and make it useless. The fact that it is demand which binds society together as a unit is evident, for if there is no mutual demand on the part of two persons, if neither of them or one only needs the services of the other, they do not exchange. Whereas if someone wants what someone else has, they exchange, getting wine, for instance, and exporting corn in return. Here then the wine and the corn must be equated. Money is useful too for future exchange. It is a sort of security which we possess that, if we do not want a thing now, we shall be able to get it when we do want it. For if we bring money, it will be in our power to get what we want. Money, it is true, is subject to the same laws as other goods. Its value is not always the same. However, it tends to be more constant in value than anything else. All things then must have a money value to make exchange possible, and therewith the association of man and man. Money then is like a measure that equates things by making them commensurable, for association would be impossible without exchange, exchange without equality, and equality without commensurability. Chapter 9. The nature of the just and the unjust has now been described. These definitions make it clear that the just conduct is a mean between committing and suffering injustice, for the former is to have too much and the latter to have too little. But justice is a mean not in the same sense as the other virtues, but rather as aiming at a mean amount, while injustice aims at extremes in amount. Through justice, a man does deliberately what is just and acts as a divider, either between himself and somebody else, or between two people, in such a way as not to give himself too large and his neighbor too small a share of something desirable, or conversely, himself something too small and his neighbor too large a share of something injurious, but he gives both himself and his neighbor a share proportionately equal, and the same when he divides anything between two other people. Injustice, on the contrary, aims at the unjust, and the unjust is disproportionate excess and defect of something profitable or injurious. So injustice is excess and defect because it aims at excess and defect. In one's own case, it aims at an excess of something absolutely profitable and a deficiency of something injurious. In the cases of other people, it behaves in generally similar, and the disproportion may take the form either of excess or of defect. In an unjust act, the defect is the suffering of injustice, the excess is the infliction of it. Let this be our account of the nature of justice and injustice, and similarly of the just and the unjust in general. Chapter 10. Political justice is partly natural and partly legal. The part which is natural is that which has the same force everywhere and is independent of opinions. The part which is legal is that which, in the beginning, does not matter what form it takes, but matters when it has been laid down. As, for instance, that the ransom of a prisoner shall be a mina, or that a goat and not 2 sheep shall be offered in sacrifice. Such too are all laws made for particular cases, like the law for the sacrifice in honor of Brasidas at Amphipolis, and the provisions of popular decrees. Some people think that all rules of justice are of this sort, because what is natural is changeless and has the same authority everywhere, even as fire burns equally here and in Persia. But the rules of justice, they see, are continually altering. Now this is not altogether true, though true to some extent. Among the gods indeed it is probably not true at all. But in this world, though there is such a thing as natural justice, still all justice is variable. Nevertheless, there is a justice which is natural and a justice which is not. Within the sphere of possibility, it is easy to see what kind of thing is natural and what is not natural but legal and conventional, though both kinds are alike variable. The distinction will apply in other cases. Thus, the right hand is naturally stronger than the left, yet everyone may acquire the power of using both hands alike. Rules of justice based on convention and convenience may be compared to standard measures, for the measure of wine and corn are not everywhere equal, but larger in wholesale and smaller in retail shops. Similarly, the rules of justice that exist not by nature but by the will of man are not everywhere the same, for governments themselves are not everywhere the same, although there is for every place only one naturally perfect government. There are 3 kinds of injury people do to one another in society. An act done in ignorance is a mistake, when the person affected, or the thing done, or the instrument, or the result is not what the doer expected. For instance, he expected not to hit with that particular instrument, or not to hit that particular person, or not to get that particular result from his blow, but the result turned out different from his expectation. He intended to prick a person but not to wound him, or the person was someone else, or the instrument not what he thought. Now, 1. When the hurt done is contrary to expectation, it is an accident, but 2. When, though not contrary to expectation, it does not imply malice, it is a mistake, for a person makes a mistake when the origin of the harm is in himself, but meets with an accident when it is outside himself. But 3. When a person acts knowingly but without deliberating, it is an act of injustice, like all human acts which spring from anger and other necessary or natural emotions. For in doing that harm, and making those mistakes, he is unjust, and they are acts of injustice. Still, it does not follow that he is an unjust or a wicked man, since the injury he does is not the consequence of malice. But, 4. When the act is the result of deliberate purpose, the doer himself is unjust and wicked. We rightly hold that acts that spring from anger are not done of malice aforethought, for not he who acts in anger, but he who provoked the anger begins the quarrel. Again, in most cases of anger, it is not whether a deed was done or not, but whether it was just that causes the dispute. For anger starts at the appearance of injustice. It is not as in quarrels over contracts, where two parties dispute about a fact and one of them must be a rascal, unless they are acting so in forgetfulness. Here they agree as to the fact, but dispute as to the side of which justice lies. The case of a deliberate aggressor is different. He knows on which side justice lies, but the person who acts in anger thinks he is injured, and his opponent does not think so. If a man injures another of deliberate purpose, he acts unjustly. Such acts of injustice necessarily prove the man who does them to be unjust, if they violate the rules of proportion or equality. Similarly, a man is just who acts justly from deliberate purpose, but his act is just if he merely acts voluntarily. Involuntary acts are either pardonable or not. They are pardonable if they are mistakes committed not only in ignorance but from ignorance. But if they are not committed from ignorance but in ignorance, from some passion which is neither natural nor common to humanity, they are not pardonable. Chapter 12. We have still to discuss two of the questions we proposed. 1. Is it he who gives someone else more than he deserves, or he who receives it that commits an injustice? 2. Can a person be unjust to himself? The questions are connected, for if the first of the two alternatives is possible, if it is the giver and not the recipient of the excessive share who commits the injustice, then if a person knowingly and voluntarily gives more to another than to himself, he does an injustice to himself. This is what modest people seem to do, for a good man is inclined to take less than his share. Perhaps, however, the case is not so simple as it seems, for it may happen that in giving more of one good thing to another than to himself, the man hopes to get more than his share of some other good, such as a fine reputation or pure nobility. The question may be answered by reference to our definition of an unjust act, for, in the case supposed, the giver suffers nothing contrary to his own wish. Consequently, he is not unjustly treated, at least not on this score, but at most is only damaged. Still, it is evident that the giver may commit the injustice and not always the recipient of the excessive share. For it does not follow that if a person gets more than is just, he is acting unjustly, but only if he voluntarily does it, as does the person with whom the action originates, that is, the giver, and not the receiver. Again, there are various senses of the word do. There is a sense in which lifeless things, such as a hand or a servant who obeys his master's bidding, may be said to kill. But the receiver does not commit injustice, though he does something unjust. Again, if the divider of goods gives his judgment in ignorance, he commits no injustice, nor is his judgment unjust in the eyes of the law. though in a sense it is unjust, since there is a difference between legal justice and primordial justice. But if knowingly he pronounces an unjust judgment, he is himself aiming to get an excessive share of popularity or of revenge. And if, induced by motives such as these, he pronounces an unjust judgment, he has got something unfairly as truly as if he were to take a share of the booty, even though in such a case a judge who awards a plot of land unjustly will receive not land but money. Chapter 15. The foregoing remarks clarify the question whether a man can be unjust to himself or not. For justice, in one of its senses, means the exercise of the various virtues that are prescribed by law. Thus, the law does not permit suicide, and whatever it does not permit, it forbids. Again, when a man in defiance of the law voluntarily hurts another, not by way of retaliation, he commits an injustice voluntarily, meaning with knowledge of the person affected and the instrument used. Now, a man who cuts his own throat voluntarily in a fit of anger is acting in defiance of right reason, and this the law does not allow. Accordingly, he is acting unjustly. Yet, unjustly to whom? Surely to the state and not to himself, for he suffers voluntarily, and no one can call what he voluntarily suffers an injustice. That is why the state inflicts a penalty, that is, attaches a certain ignominy to the suicide, on the ground that he is doing an injustice to the state. Further, nobody commits injustice without committing some particular act of injustice, but nobody commits adultery with his own wife, or breaks into his own house, or steals his own property. Plainly, it is bad to suffer injustice and bad to commit it, for the one means having less and the other having more than the mean. And the mean corresponds to the healthy in medicine and good condition in gymnastic training. Still, it is worse to commit injustices than to suffer it. For the doing of injustice is blameworthy and implies wickedness, either complete and absolute wickedness or something near to. For not every voluntary unjust act implies injustice of character. But the suffering of injustice implies neither wickedness nor injustice in oneself. The suffering then is in itself the lesser evil, though it may turn out incidentally the greater. Theory, however, does not concern itself with such a possibility. It calls pleurisy a more serious mischief than a stumble, though the latter may become incidentally more serious than the pleurisy, as, for example, when the man who stumbles falls, and because of his fall is taken prisoner by the enemy and put to death. Speaking metaphorically or by analogy, we may say there is a justice, not indeed between a man and himself, but between certain parts of himself. I do not mean justice in every sense, but the justice that appears in the relation of master and slave, or of husband and wife, for these are the relations of the rational and the irrational parts of the soul. People have in mind this relation of parts when they say a man can be unjust to himself, because the parts are liable to suffer something contrary to their desires. Hence there should be some such justice between them as between ruler and ruled. We may take this as sufficient description of justice and all the other moral virtues.